entrepreneurial, leadership, intellectual. This is the Cultural Connections Podcast.
And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Ives, and I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to remind all of our viewers that are watching with us right now that we are recording this episode live on Wednesday, October 30th, 2024. And this episode is being live streamed to YouTube. Therefore, if you have a question that you would like our guest to answer, please feel free to comment the question below, and we'll do our best to get your questions answered live. If you've seen our past couple of episodes on the podcast, you've noticed that we've sort of started a mini series specifically pertaining here in Massachusetts to the 5 ballot questions. Next Tuesday on the ballot, there are 5 different ballot questions that are being proposed to voters, and our goal here on these episodes are to educate you, the voter, on these questions and how to understand these ballot questions. For each of these 5 questions, we have reached out to both sides of each question and have so far done episodes so far on question 4, both sides, and question 5, both sides. Today on the podcast, we are going over to question 2, and specifically why to voting no on question 2. Our guest today, before I introduce our guest, the question 2, for those that do not know, is a question that would be a law requiring that students have mastered skills, competencies of state standards as a replacement for the state MCAS. Joining me to talk about why you should vote no on this question is Matt Hills. Matt and his wife Lisa live in Newton, and along with their 4 children who were who went through the Newton Public School system as graduates, and Matt has received his bachelor's degree in economics and politics from Brandeis University and an MBA from the Harvard Business School. Matt is the former chair of the Newton School Committee, serving 8 years through 2018, and he is currently the vice chair of the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you having me.
Thank you again. So before I go further, I always like our guests to give a little bit more further of an introduction to themselves than what I just did. If you can further introduce yourself and give us a little bit further about your background.
I mean, you captured a lot in those 4 sentences, but when I was younger, I lived in Nashville, Tennessee, which was a very different city than it is now. I like to say to people, back when I lived there, it was a small little southern city that history had long since passed behind or left behind. That's changed a lot now. Still a kid, we moved to Toronto. Then I went to college here at Brandeis and went to graduate school and kept working here and never left. Roughly the same story for Lisa, other than she didn't grow up in Nashville or Toronto. And we lived in the city in Boston for quite a while in the Back Bay. And after our first 2 kids, we moved to Newton and have had just a wonderful experience living here as part of a larger community, and as also part of the Newton Public School community. And we feel very, very lucky to live in this state and live in this city.
That's great. And Newton is a great city. I can attest to that myself too, being here at Newton as well. My first question then here to you is today, as I just mentioned, we are talking about question 2, which I gave a brief understanding of what the question is that is being proposed. Can you go a little bit further in explaining what question 2 is, so our voters at home have an understanding what this question entails?
So I'll separate my answer. I'll save the second part of the answer for a follow-up from you.
Sure.
As to why I'm opposed to it. But let me just explain, as you asked, what it is. So Massachusetts is relatively unique among all the states in that we have only one statewide requirement to graduate high school, and that is this test, passing the 10th grade MCAS. And MCAS is the state's standardized test that are given grades 3 through 8 and grades 10. If this question passes, Massachusetts will be one of the few states in the country, it'll be one of 3 without any comprehensive statewide requirement. This would eliminate MCAS as the graduation requirement and prohibit any further statewide assessment for graduation. If I could sum it up, this is repeal, period, not repeal and replace. So let's not be confused about what this is. This would send Massachusetts back kind of to the 30, 40, 50 years ago, 351 districts with 351 graduation requirements. No state standard, no minimum requirement for graduation, no consistency across districts. There was a little bit of editorializing in there, not just factually what it is.
Of course. No, I appreciate that. Then my next question then to you is obviously we're here to talk about more on the no side today on why to vote no on this question and an understanding from your standpoint as to why to vote no. Can you give us some understanding then as to why vote no on this question and the importance of voting no?
Sure. So sort of first, kind of the last part of what I said to your first question, out of 51 states, just for some perspective, out of 51 states, 50 states plus DC, 49 have comprehensive statewide requirements for graduation. Of those 49, Massachusetts is the only one whose only statewide requirement is the test. So if you hear we're one of 7 or 8 states that still have the test, yeah, but we're the only one out of 50 states plus DC whose only requirement is a test. Other states have other requirements that are not legally possible in Massachusetts. So just for some perspective, we will be an outlier and not the kind of outlier that we've been for 20 or 30 years if this passes. For 20 or 30 years, we've been an outlier in terms of quality of education being #1 in the country. We've stalled a little there. If this passes, we'll be one of 3 states with no statewide mandate at all. Say a few other things about it. Because as I've written before, the gap is fairly large between reality and fiction in terms of what you hear about this. So few points. First, the test is a really good job at being predictive of 2 things we look for in a successful K through 12 public school system: preparation to enter the workforce and preparation to enroll and graduate from a 2 or 4-year college. And if you look at the data for the 10th grade MCAS and the scores, they correlate very well to age 30 income and likelihood of enrolling and graduating from a 2 and 4-year college. And overall for the student body, as well as for every different student group, racial and ethnic student group, it is true that the higher the score on the 10th grade MCAS, the more likely you are to have both higher levels of income as well as enroll and graduate from post-secondary education. So the test is serving a very useful purpose. It's not an IQ test. It's not an SAT. It is testing knowledge that is supposed to have been taught that in our educational frameworks, which are voluntary, not mandatory.
Right.
Number 2, we used to hear regularly that thousands and thousands of students were not getting a diploma because of the test. Not true. The commentary has now caught up to the facts on this. Approximately 1% of the statewide graduating class does not pass the 10th grade MCAS, but otherwise meets local requirements for graduation. It's approximately 700 students a year. And given the importance of getting above that score in predicting future income and enrollment in post-secondary education, the impetus needs to be on getting all students over the hump, which it is for most districts. Number three, most students who do pass do so on their first attempt, which is almost always grade 10. And almost, when I say most, 92.5% of the students who pass do so on their first attempt. 97% of those who pass do so by their second or third attempt. That's virtually everyone who passes early in their test taking career. When you hear this is a one-time test, that's a falsehood. You have 5 chances to pass the test in high school. You can take it after graduation indefinitely. And there are appeals processes for special needs students and appeals processes for, we'll call them students who are decent students, but not good test takers. They're nervous, they have anxiety, and approximately 70 to 75% of the appeals are granted. So the only people, when you hear this is a one-time test, yeah, if you pass it the first time, it's a one-time test. But other than that, you have 5 times plus appeals, plus a lifetime of chances to pass it. And virtually everyone passes the first time. There are 3 separate tests: math, science, and ELA.
Yes.
Few other points. You've got a significant percentage of students who drop out in grade 12 have already passed the MCAS graduation requirement. So when you hear about students dropping out because they couldn't pass the MCAS requirement, I have no way of knowing why certain students are dropping out, but 2/3 to 3/4 of those who have dropped out in grade 12 have already passed the requirement. The vast majority of districts have 3 or fewer students who are not graduating because of the MCAS. Most of the issues concentrated in 15 to 20 districts, and almost half the districts have 0 students who don't graduate because of the MCAS. And the final point I'll make, just to remind you where I started, out of 51 states plus DC, we are the only one for whom this is the sole graduation requirement, and we will be one of 3 states with no statewide requirements. It is unclear whether this even complies with the Massachusetts Constitution that makes the state responsible for equitable education for all its students. This ballot initiative, if it passes, is bad for everyone in the state. It's particularly bad for students who are historically marginalized and underrepresented. Those are some of the student groups that have benefited the most from education reform, including MCAS and the MCAS graduation requirement.
So before we go any further, again, I just wanted to remind our viewers at home that are watching that this is the Cultural Connections podcast. We are live here on Wednesday, October 30th, 2024, and we are live streaming here to YouTube. So if you have questions for our guests, please feel free to comment below. We're talking today about Massachusetts ballot question number 2 that'll be appearing on next Tuesday's ballot. If you haven't voted already, make sure you go and vote. Question 2, as was just again explained, is a law that, if it was passed, would be requiring that students have mastered skills, competencies of state standards as a replacement for the state MCAS that we're talking about here. My next question then to you here then is, in the what? Actually, let's put it this way: if this were to pass, actually, let me rephrase this. If this doesn't pass, it keeps things the same way. And I think there's a lot of what I've seen, and what it seems to be is that I think a lot of people have the misunderstanding, the yes versus no side of this question, because it can lead, I think, into a confusement of a question. But you say that Massachusetts would be one of 3 states that doesn't, one of very few states in the country that doesn't have anything. How would things progress? I mean, if you don't have any requirement then to graduate, would there how would things move forward from that point forward if, let's say, this did pass? What would
So, It's a great question, and I'll answer it first by saying your question gets to the heart of the reason why Governor Maura Healey, Lieutenant Governor Kim Driscoll, Education Secretary Pat Tutwiler, President Karen Spilka who leads the Senate, Speaker Ron Mariano, who leads the House, among others, are against this. It gets to the very question you're asking, what's replacing it? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. There is no statewide requirement. The notion that districts will self-certify, that state standards are being followed, that's what you hear from the yes side. There are no state requirements. This is a false choice. There is absolutely no statewide requirement, no statewide consistency in graduation, in education levels for graduation, if this question passes. The things that other states do, which theoretically is possible, is not possible under the current legal framework. There is no ability under the law for additional requirements, including detailed, comprehensive course requirements that other states have. There is no ability under the law to put those in place.
No, I understand what you're saying. The next question then to you is then, as I've asked actually with the other ballot questions, why now? What leads to the idea of bringing this into discussion now all of a sudden when and having this as a topic of discussion? I from my understanding is I feel like that this has always been something that's been ongoing for years, but there's never been any real formal discussion. I think what seems like until now. Why are we bringing this to to the table now to the voters? What do you think the reasoning on that is now?
Yes, well, one can only speculate because obviously I don't think this is, I think this is really, really bad policy at any time it's brought forward. So the only way I can answer the question is this is the time that the supporters of yes have decided to bring it forward to a ballot initiative. And it'll either pass or it won't pass.
Absolutely. Now, as from what I understand, I can say that I'm a graduate of the Newton Public School System as well, from many years ago, and that I know that there's been changes to how they to the state MCAS over the years. I was under the impression as well. I mean, maybe things have since changed since when I graduated, but at the time of when I graduated, there was also the reports of also having the history of having, I think, I think it was a pilot at the time. It sounds like it probably never went through a pilot for the history MCAS at one point. Um, how for people that you let's talk about the fact here is because not everyone. How do you explain this to a voter, let's say, that has a child or something in the school system that is not a test taker and has their concerns about the fact that okay, maybe I mean that there shouldn't be something to pass and that it'll be make it so they can at least know that they can graduate high school. How do you explain that to a voter, to a parent that is concerned for their child?
So I understand the concern. So the first thing I'd say is I get the concern. Remember, Lisa and I have been, have had 4 Newton Public School kids, K through 12, before, who graduated from Newton Public Schools. Different personalities, different test taking styles. But here's what I would say. Let's start with the very big picture. 1% of the total graduating class does not graduate because of this. So, and I assure you that more than 1% of the graduating class consists of nervous test takers. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, the vast majority of districts have no one or almost no one not graduating solely because of the MCAS requirement. So just to put this in perspective, there's lots and lots of students who fall within that category of bad test takers. Now let's get into more of the detail here. In addition, as I said earlier, to 5 different opportunities to pass before you graduate, and 92.5% passed the first time in grade 10. In addition to that, there are these two appeals processes, 70 to 75% of which get approved. And one of those appeals process is specifically designed for the situation you've described. Decent grades, doesn't even have to be great grades, decent grades, but poor test taker. And we can accommodate that. This is not supposed to be a barrier to keep people from passing. This is supposed to be ensuring some minimum standard because across districts and some level of consistency. Because if you look at what the analysis shows about a student's likelihood of earning a living wage, let alone going to a 2 or 4 year college at low MCAS scores, you do not want your child handed a piece of paper without the school district ensuring that they're at a certain level of educational achievement, or that child is going to be paying for the failure of the school system for the rest of their lives if they're not at that level. And that's the way it was before what's called the Grand Bargain, the Educational Reform Act from 31 years ago, which put in place significantly more state funding in exchange for some standards and accountability, and eventually a graduation requirement, all of which is tied to MCAS.
Absolutely. No, I can understand that. Now, let me put it to you then in this context here that let's say again that this does get passed, being that what would then be the fact is, so would you think without having the MCAS, what is how do you prepare I mean, besides obviously what's taught to them in the classroom by their teacher, that how do you prepare them then for what's ahead of them? I mean, and do you believe that the MCAS as it is right now, I should say, let me put this as a different question, how the MCAS as it is right now is set up to make a student succeed, or could there be tweaks to the system to make it better to help a student succeed?
So there's a few different questions in there. The first is, I mean, I want to be clear. It's not like if the MCAS graduation requirement disappears, no one's going to be prepared for the workforce. No one's going to be prepared for 2 or 4 year college. What I would say is, without the MCAS graduation requirement, there will be no minimum standard that students face. Some districts will undoubtedly be fine. That minimum standard might be lower than it would otherwise be with the state requirement, but it's not like districts are going to stop educating children. But you're going to see a few things. Number one, lack of any consistency across 351 districts with 351 different graduation requirements. Number two, local graduation requirements, if this passes. Number two, some districts will go back to the way things were before 93, which is just passing students along that otherwise shouldn't be passed along, handed a diploma without having the obligation to ensure that they're at a certain level of academic achievement before they get that diploma. Those students, as I said earlier, are going to pay for the failure of our state and our school system to ensure they have that minimum education level. And the third thing you will likely see is a widening of achievement gaps and a widening of graduation rates between historically underserved student groups and overall state averages. To flip that around, when the graduation requirement went into place, if you look at the annual data, the following is a factually overwhelmingly true comment. Achievement levels rose significantly beginning when the graduation requirement was put in place, and the graduation rate rose significantly overall and for each different student group. That's not random. That's not coincidence. There are, of course, other things that impacted it. other than the graduation requirement. The graduation requirement went into place almost 10 years after all the money started flowing and after MCAS through just as a test went into place. So once that graduation requirement went into place, you saw the increases in the graduation rate and the increases in educational achievement that are the entire reason for putting it in place. Overall achievement rose, achievement or opportunity gaps narrowed. We've plateaued
Hmm.
and had some decline since the pandemic.
Right.
That means we need to put sort of double and triple down on efforts, not do away with the test, which is telling us where we have ground to make up.
You know, it's interesting. You bringing up the pandemic. Obviously, we know the pandemic from an educational standpoint did a significant number on students in schools, not just here in Massachusetts, but all throughout the country, really all over the place. How, do you think that the idea of bringing this to the table now has anything to do with the fact that there was concern coming out of a pandemic that maybe that there's ways now is the time to rethink our approach to graduation requirements? But you mentioned, I mean, the numbers were a little bit up and down during the pandemic. How do you think do you think the pandemic played any role into decision making today, from your own opinion, to this bringing this?
I mean, look, I'm speculating about people I strongly disagree with,
Yeah.
you know, the people who brought this question forward. Some or most of the groups that are in favor of eliminating the requirement have been against state requirements, state testing, state anything other than money from the state for many years. Whether the timing is coincidental, I don't know. I don't know whether it would have come up before if there was no pandemic. I don't know if I don't know.
Right. Oh, I understand.
But we are where we are, and it's here, and the question's here, and we need to defeat it.
Right. Absolutely. No, I completely understand. Well, I'm gonna again one more time here remind all of our viewers at home that you are watching, listening here to the Cultural Connections podcast. We're live on Wednesday, October 30th, 2024. And we are specifically talking today about one of the 5 ballot questions here in Massachusetts, specifically today, question 2, which is a law. If passed, it would be a law that would require students to have mastered skills, competencies of state standards as a replacement for the state MCAS. And we're joined by Matt Hills, who is currently serving as the chair of the board, the vice chair of the Massachusetts Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. As we start now towards the end of the podcast, I want to give you the chance one more time here, as we already reached close to a half hour, why voters should vote no on this question and the really importance of what's at stake next week in the election with this question.
Thanks, Brian. I would just make it very simple. This is horrible education policy that will negatively impact large numbers of students and cause particular damage to historically underrepresented groups. If this passes, we will undo much of the progress we've made over the last 30 years. We will certainly risk undoing it. It's terrible education policy. It's bad policy if it's honestly presented. It's miserable policy if there's a propaganda war that's distorting the benefits of having this policy in place.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I understand. That makes a lot of sense. And if people want to understand more about this ballot question, is there places online they can go and check out to understand and read more about this?
So the No campaign is Protect Our Kids, No on 2. If you just Google that, you'll come right up to the No campaign. I'm obviously happy to speak on behalf of the No campaign, but there are folks there working on it, and that's not me. I have my role as, among other things, vice chair of the state board.
Okay, well, thank you so much for that. Again, I want to thank Matt here for joining me today. Hard to believe, again, a half hour here can fly by so quickly. Again, I want to reiterate here on the podcast that these episodes that you've been seeing on all of these 5 ballot questions are specifically here to inform you as the voter of what is at stake with these 5 questions. We have, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast, if you haven't seen some of the other episodes we've done on these topics, please go back and check them out. One of them, we have so far done the question 4. We did both sides of question 4 and both sides of question 5. Both of them are available on all of our platforms, and especially if you're live streamed with us here on YouTube, you can see those episodes as well right here. As again a reminder as well, the Cultural Connections podcast is not endorsing one side or other of these questions. We are specifically here just to educate you as the voter on these questions, so you have can make an informed decision next Tuesday, or if you choose to vote early beforehand. As a reminder, I'll also mention about with voting that the election is next Tuesday, less than a week from today. Hard to believe, less than a week out. If you have yet to vote, you can still vote early. Early voting is open until the end of this week at until 5 p.m. So if you have not voted early, you may vote early, and you can check online on doing so. If you want to vote in person, the polls will be open next Tuesday, November 5th, all day long for you to vote in person. That said, again, we're hoping still to get the remaining of sides of the questions on, including the yes side here to question 2, along with questions 1 and 3, which we are still waiting to hear back from. So we have invited all sides on, and we'll see what happens. In addition, here I'll quickly mention on the Cultural Connections podcast, we are thinking of doing some live election result coverage as it comes in next Tuesday night. So if you're interested in joining us, please feel free to tune in around the 7-8 p.m. time frame. Will be live right here on this YouTube page if you're watching live streamed on YouTube. Do check it out, as we'll be bringing in some results as they come in and making our own predictions as well. So for now, again, I want to thank Matt Hills for joining me today, and I want
Thank you,
to
Brian.
thank you, and I want to thank everyone at home for watching. I'm Brian Ives. I am the producer and the host of the Cultural Connections podcast. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast. For more information on today's episode, be sure to check out our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also watch this episode again in its entirety on our YouTube channel. This podcast is also available on listening platforms Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Breaker, Radio Public, and New TV. Thanks again for watching this episode of the Cultural Connections podcast.